All right, here we go, guys. All right, so I have my area set up, and I'm just going to start with my background. So I just want you to kind of see, with my reference, I'll kind of put it like this. I'm going to focus on this particular area. Oops, hang on. I'm going to focus on this particular area with my background. So for my colors, I have magenta, the darker green in watercolor, it's called Viridian. I have a light green, a lemon yellow, and a yellow ochre. So for some of my colors, just to start with. All right, and then I do have my dual water container with paper towels to the side and multiple brushes. So in order to start my background, I am going to go ahead and wet my paper. I'm going to start with a wet wash. So right in here, the one thing which is nice about that wet wash is my paint's only going to go where I want it to go. And I also lightened up my pencil lines here. I'm going with a softer bristle brush. And I like this particular one because I can get the water exactly where I want it to go. And it's got the nice point. So I like this tip a lot. Okay, so I have this area here. And I'm going to go ahead and get started with some color. Just making sure I can see that it's wet where I want it to be wet and not where I want it to be dry. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this section. Now, one of the things I want to do with my color is I really want my flower to stand out a lot. So I'm going to be using my Viridian green here. I'll kind of just move everything up this way so you can kind of sort of see it. I'll slide it on down. So I have my Viridian green. I'm going to use a little bit of magenta to strengthen that color. It's complements. Complements work really well together. I'll kind of show you so you can see better. All right, I'm going to add a little bit of my lighter green in here just to kind of get my background color going. A little bit of a yellow. I'm just kind of playing around to do a little bit of some color matching. Now, when you guys are working with your paints, just so you know, it typically dries a little bit lighter. So if you see that your colors look a little lighter and not quite as vibrant, that is going to be why. So I'm going to start with this particular color, and I'm going to ultimately begin to add some other colors as I continue, as I start to work. So the one thing I like about backgrounds is I can actually kind of play around with the amount of water that's on here, and I can slightly change my color just by adding little wet dabs of color. So I can go and where it's darker. I'm going to use this background as a gauge to go by, but I'm also going to give it some of my own personality. And one thing which is cool about this with the background, there's a couple areas that are a little bit lighter. There's like a little bit of a yellowy ochre. So I'm putting that in here too. If it gets too dry, I can just go right back and add more water. Now, one thing you don't want to do with watercolor paper is you kind of want to put the color down and just let it rest. You don't want to do anything like go back and forth over and over your paper. I call that scrubbing your paper. That is not a good idea with watercolor paper. What happens with it, if your paper starts to pill and ball up, let it go. Like just leave it alone, because then, that's one thing about watercolor paper. There's different types of it. This is a decent watercolor paper. There's better papers that are out there, but as far as the quality and what you can do with it, it really gives you a nice opportunity to make some changes as you are working. So I'm just going to go ahead and put some color on here. Now, I may decide to go back in, the next class period or whatever, and add another layer. So I'm just going to kind of play around with it a little bit. And I can be, go right and get nice crisp edges here as I want to. I like how the color is muted. To me, it kind of gives that blurry look as I was talking to you about. And I feel like that works so nice for a background, and it really helps to keep that focus on your subject, number one. And number two, it also helps to work with complementary colors as you're working, because it gives that, it lessens the intensity of your color and ultimately helps to create more depth in your pieces. So I'm going to kind of let these colors start to mesh together a little bit. If they're not blending as much as I want them to, I can go in and I can actually just add a little bit more water. So I'm starting to do some of this nice color building. And again, notice that I'm like touching the paper, getting my marks down on there, but right now, and that's the other thing about working with watercolor, is you're gonna have to move around your painting. So this area is gonna be wet, so needless to say, I cannot do anything else by it because my colors will then go ahead and start to blend together. Okay, so this is just gonna be the beginning. Think about where you wanna start. And I'm going to kind of just, work a little bit around my background just to get some color down and just to get it started. Now, if I wanted to use, another technique with this, I certainly could. Like, let's say I wanted to do something a little bit with maybe the salt technique or whatever, I could do that if I wanted to. Keep in mind, you're going to be using a total of like 4 techniques at least, but that's really, really easy to do, especially with what you need to do for this, because right now I have a dry wash. You could even say that I'm doing a wet on wet. I know we didn't do that as far as a technique, but colors to mesh together works really well. And I am kind of moving toward this piece, getting a few more colors on. Now we also have to keep in mind drying time. For those of you who are here in person, if your piece is too wet to take with you, you may decide to just leave it here till later in the day. You can always swing by and get it. You can put it on the drying rack. I don't want anything to happen to your pieces. Okay, so for right now, I have the beginnings of what I want to start. And I can move around and work on more of the background. I can't lift it because it is pretty wet in a couple of areas. As you can see, I still have the beginnings of my painting. There's a little pinkish concept down here. I'm just going to throw in a little bit of magenta color. And voila. So I'll kind of like, take a look and reevaluate, once this dries. I can strengthen. If like right now, like this, I wanted to strengthen it a little bit around my petal. I can just add a smidgen more paint. It still is wet enough that it's going to go ahead and work well with the paint. So that's one thing which is really nice. And we'll just, again, especially if you're here in person, we kind of really just have to monitor time just to make sure that you guys have, a good 5 minutes for your pieces to dry. Typically, and that's one thing too, is especially with the heat that's on, things are going to dry pretty fast. Now I see I have this small little area where it's super, super dark in here. And I'm going to go ahead and I have my mixture of my Viridian green, my magenta, and I used a little bit of that yellow ochre. And I'm just going to go in right now with just a dry wash in this little area. So don't be surprised that with your painting, you guys are going to have to kind of move around a little bit. I have some little, tidbits of areas too I could go into, such as like this little area right in here with that yellow green. And I see I have a little smidgen of a pencil mark to erase before I do that. Compared to the pen and ink, you guys are going to probably be really surprised at the pace in which you're going to work with this, just because, needless to say, with the pen and ink, that's just something, it's a longer process. I'm looking at my paint colors here to make sure I get a color that I'm happy with. So I'm pretty much, most of my paint colors are going to be through mixtures versus working right out of the tube. And I'm starting with this one with a dry wash as well. Making sure I have a little bit of variety. Okay, so, so I'm going to go around and like pick little pieces in areas that I can do a smidgen more work with. But this is a good way to get started. It's a little bit darker over here in this little section. So now that I have the wet paint down, I can just go ahead and make a few more adjustments. All right, so I have the beginnings. I can go and do more in my other background areas, but I just wanted to show you, how you can get started, a good way to get started. Your paint colors. One thing which is nice, guys, when you have this, if you hang on to them, you can use your same paint colors. All you have to do once they dry out is just add a little water to it, and they rehydrate and you can use them again. So I recommend if anybody is taking theirs home and they're wet like that, if you have an area like this that you want to dry off, you can. But I would keep your paint so that way you do have them. You can always use, if it's wet and you don't have a little container to put it in, you can always use a piece of saran wrap. I have plastic wrap here for you guys. Okay, and then, so it was kind of fun. It was just like I was anxious to get started. And then I'll go in with some other kinds of things, when that one is ready. Cleanup is really simple with your watercolor, as you guys already know. It's just washing out your brushes real quickly, rinsing out your water containers. And then the big thing is just letting this dry for a tad bit of time to kind of get you going. All right. Perfect. Guys, I will ultimately post this then. So I'm going to stop recording, and that way you guys will have it.